Hello viewers, in our previous video we talked about literature in general, what is literature. In this video we are going to talk about the relation of literature to life. So there is an intimate connection between literature and life. It is in fact life which is the subject matter of literature. Life provides the raw material on which literature imposes an artistic form. Literature, as we defined in the previous section, is the communication of the writer's experience of life. But this connection between literature and life is not so simple as it seems. This problem has been discussed by some of the greatest literary critics of the world, and their conclusions have been sometimes contradictory. Plato, the great Greek philosopher, was the first to give a serious thought to this problem, the relation of literature to life. In these discussions, he referred mainly to poetry, but what he said about poetry can be equally applied to literature as a whole. He regarded poetry as a mere imitation of life, and thus he condemned the poets. His opposition to poetry was based on his theory of knowledge. According to him, true reality consists in the ideas of things, of which individual objects are but reflections or imitations. For example, when we say a black dog, a good dog, a lame dog, etc., we are comparing the dog which we actually see with the ideal dog, our idea of the dog, which is the true, unchanging reality, while the dogs which we name as black, good, lame, etc., are mere reflections and imitations of that reality. Thus, the poet who imitates those objects which are themselves imitations of reality is obviously producing something which is still further removed from ultimate reality. Plato developed this argument first with reference to the painter. Painting is an imitation of a specific object or group of objects, and if it is not but that, if reality lies not in individual objects, but in general ideas or forms, then from the point of view of the philosopher whose main interest is in apprehending reality, the painter is not doing anything particularly valuable. Just as the painter only imitates what he sees and does not know how to make or use what he sees, he could paint a bit but not make it. So the poet imitates reality without necessarily understanding it. Poetry or literature as a whole is an imitation of imitation, and thus twice removed from truth. There is an obvious error in Plato's reasoning. Being too much of a philosopher and moralist, he could not see clearly the relation between literature and life. He is right when he says that the poet produces something which is less than reality. It purports to represent, but he does not perceive that he also creates something more than reality. This error was corrected by Plato's pupil Aristotle. Aristotle was the student of Plato. In his Poetics, he undertook to examine the nature and qualities of imaginative literature with a view to demonstrating that it is true and not false, as Plato had shown it. He agreed with Plato that poetry is an imitation of reality, but according to him, this imitation is the objective representation of life in literature, or, in other words, the imaginative reconstruction of life. Poetry is thus not connected with the outside world in the simple and direct fashion supposed by Plato. The poet first derives an inspiration from the world by the power of his imagination. The art of poetry then imitates this imaginative inspiration in language. The art of poetry or literature as a whole exists to give shape and substance to a certain kind of imaginative impulse. The existence of the art implies the existence of the impulse. Now it is just possible to imagine life exactly as it is, but the exciting thing is to imagine life as it might be. And it is then that imagination becomes an impulse capable of inspiring poetry. This is true even in the case of what we call realism in literature. It is true even when the life imagined was originally an actuality of some highly exciting nature in itself. Imagination may no more than concentrate the actuality by dropping out all its insignificant passages. But that will be enough to make the resultant poetry or literature something different from the copy of the world which Plato's condemnation assumed it to be. This was Aristotle's reply to Plato. Art or literature is not a slavish imitation of reality twice removed from truth, presenting as it must do individual men or women in the trappings and circumstances of life. It does not leave them there, but pierces to what is significant in action and character, expressing through their words and actions that is true for all human nature, the poet's truth, the universal truth. The poet is concerned with truth, but not the truth of the analyst, the historian, or the photographer. The poet's business is not to write of events that have happened, but of what may happen, of things that are possible in the light of probability or necessity. For this reason, poetry is a more philosophical, a more serious thing than history. For whilst history deals with the particular only, this event or that event, poetry deals with the universal. The poet selects from life according to the principle of poetic unity and poetic truth. He seeks to draw out what is relevant and representative, and to present it harmoniously in a self-contained situation. The truth with which he deals is not that which the anatomist may lay bare on the dissecting table, but that which a poet divines and translates. Aristotle thus met Plato's charge that poetry is imitation of an imitation by showing that the poet, by concerning himself with fundamental probabilities rather with casual actualities, reaches more deeply into reality than the analyst or historian. Sir Philip Sidney, who next took up the question of the relationship of literature to life, also refuted Plato's contention that literature is a mere imitation of an imitation. According to him, the poet does not imitate but creates. It is the reader who imitates what the poet creates. Taking his material from the actual world, the poet creates an ideal world by means of his imagination. For Sidney, the ideal world of the poet is of value because it is better world than the real world, and it is presented in such a way that the reader is stimulated to try and imitate it in his own practice. The problem of literature's relation to life was next taken up by Dryden, who pointed out that imaginative literature gives us a just and lively image of human nature by representing its passions and humors. This point was further developed by Dr.Johnson, who expressed the view that that the poet holds up a mirror to nature. According to him, nothing can please many and please long, but just representation of general nature. The way to please the greatest number over the longest period of time, which is the duty of imaginative literature, is to provide accurate pictures of nature. According to Dr. Johnson, the poet must know the manners and customs of men of all times and conditions, not because it is his duty to make vivid to the reader the different ways in which men have lived and behaved, but so that he is not taken in by surface differences and is able to penetrate to the common human underlying there. Walter Pater, a critic of the later 19th century who discussed the relation of literature and life in detail, remarked in his essay on style, just as in proportion as the writer's aim, consciously or unconsciously, comes to be the transcribing not of the world, not of mere fact, but but his sense of it, he becomes an artist. His work fine art and good art in proportion to the truth of his presentment of that sense. Thus, according to Pater, the literary artist does not give us a photographic imitation of reality, but a transcription of his vision of it. It is from reality or life from which the artist thoughts, but he tries to reconstruct it when he would see it steadily and see it whole. Taking into consideration the views of Plato, Aristotle, Sidney, Dryden, Johnson, and Pater, we conclude that the notion that literature is not concerned with real life is wrong. All great pieces of literature are true to life, but the literary artist is not content to hold the mirror up to nature. Because his business, as Mathew Arnold has pointed out, is a criticism of life. He concentrates on those characteristics and aspects of life which are permanent, but which might easily pass unobserved. He clutches at anything which promises some permanence among what is always fleeting. That is why he gives us a picture of reality which is more characteristic of life than anything which we discover by our own day-to-day life, day-to-day observation. The images which we are creating by our own observation of life at every moment of our working experience are hazy, half-finished, and unrelated. It is the literary artist who finishes them, makes them clear, and puts them in their wider setting, and to that extent makes life less obscure because he knows more about life than anyone can know without regarding life with his eyes. So this was all about the relation of literature to life. I hope you got it. Thank you so much for watching this video.